Welcome to Veteran State of Mind. I'm your host, Geraint Jones, and I'm feeling pretty happy right now. Do you know why I'm feeling pretty happy, guys? I am looking at combatcomeover.com's website, and there's somebody in a bikini. I'm assuming it's not the lads that run it, and all I'm going to say is worth heading over to combatcomeover.com and checking it out. I want to thank them for sponsoring the podcast. They make the most delicious pomade that an infantryman has ever eaten. Apparently, you can also put it in your hair. They're American guys. They make highly offensive pomade for true patriots. I'm a patriot. I feel like I'm more of an American patriot than most fucking Americans out there, to be honest. I feel like, if I could have my citizenship squared away, that'd be nice. And I could come and live in Vegas with my boy Seabass, who we miss. And we need to get him back on the podcast, don't we, really? But yeah, guys, should come back over, check him out. I'm having a hard time concentrating on this, on what I'm supposed to be saying, to be honest. I'm going to scroll down past that picture so that stops being so distracting. So the good thing about these Combat Comb Over guys, they were like, hey, we want to help out on the podcast because we believe what you're doing. I'm like, that's very kind of you, noble Combat Comb Over. And then I was like, what can we do in return? I was like, would you like us to harvest the organs of some of our listeners? I said, don't worry about that, mate. How about just asking your listeners to head over to @Combat Comb Over and give them a follow on social media. That's all they're asking. And in return, listeners, you get this podcast, which is made possible by Combat Comb Over. So what are you waiting for? Head over, give them a follow. All right, today's guest, Colonel Hamish Stephen de Bretton-Gordon, OBE, is a chemical weapons expert. He was a former British Army officer for 23 years and commanding officer of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment. He's been to Iraq, he's been to Afghanistan, he's done all kinds of stuff in Syria. I think he is an absolutely top bloke who has done a lot for saving lives, especially of young children, totally innocent children in Syria. I was very, very impressed with him. He's our first British Army officer on the podcast, so there you go. I always thought that the officers wouldn't want to touch us, but there you go, Hamish does. And like I said, I'm not surprised, guys. He is such a good bloke. I was really, 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 really impressed by this gentleman, and I'm looking forward to sharing the episode with you. He has a book out called Chemical Warrior, and we'll talk more about it in the podcast, but I think it's a very important book because, as Hamish will go into, it's a kind of I agree with Hamish that we've really dropped the ball as a nation with Syria. We've let a lot of people suffer there, innocent people suffer because really as a nation we didn't stand up and do the right thing, and the book's a lot about that and more as well. So I'm really glad to have him on. So yeah, guys, please give a very warm welcome to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on, mate.
Not at all. Thanks very much for having me.
I believe in accountability on this podcast, so I'm going to put my hand up to the listeners and tell them that I was very late for today's podcast because I didn't check my calendar properly, so I apologise to that. And I beseech anybody out there that has appointments to check their calendar on a daily basis and don't think that you can remember everything off the top of your head because you can't. Hamish, for you guys who are unaware of him, is very experienced officer, very experienced chemical weapons expert, and he's just written a book called Chemical Warrior. We're going to be diving into some of the bits of it today. I think, Hamish, you're the first British Army officer that we've had onto the podcast. So welcome in that capacity. We've had a lot of bitter lance corporals on here and stuff, so it's good to get the other side on.
Well, thanks very much. I mean, it's a huge honour to be on and to talk about some of the issues that are all, very relevant with, I think, what's going on at the moment. And hopefully I can give a perspective on some of the activities and Syria. I mean, a lot of chums of mine say, what's Syria like? And I try and say, well, if you were in Sangin in sort of 2008 or Basra in 2006, it's sort of like that all the time. But looking forward to having a discussion about these issues.
Yeah, so I was in Basra in 2006, and I would hate to think what that was like with chemical weapons on top of everything. I really want to talk about Syria, but I know that there's a lot of young listeners, a lot of aspiring officers listening who will get angry at me on the internet if we don't talk a little bit about your journey into the army. So how did it come about that you ended up seeking out a commission and then getting one?
Well, I come from a long line of military people. Both my grandfathers were in the army. On my mother's side, my grandfather was an army surgeon. He fought throughout the Second World War, was a really imposing figure for me, and was part of, I think, why I went down that line. I didn't know my father's father, but he was in the military as well, the Indian Army, actually. My own father was in the army. He joined as a soldier in India just after the war, and then I think he rose to the rank as sergeant in the Essex Regiment, and then was commissioned into the Royal Signals. Did 40 years, retired as a colonel some years ago, and his three brothers also were in the infantry, the Royal Anglians, and they all did a full service. So it was sort of embedded in me, I suppose. And I was fortunate. I went to university, but while there, did the regimental regular commissions board, and got a commission, and joined the Royal Tank Regiment after Sandhurst in 1988.
I suppose the question everybody is asking themselves, all the great-looking listeners from the infantry, is why did you decide to forsake the old ways of the family and go down the cavalry route?
That's a really good question. I think, again, it's people that you meet. Some of my father's friends were tankies, and I remember them discussing with me what to do, what I wanted to do. And as I described in the book, we were posted to Bahrain in the Middle East for about 3, maybe 4 years, between the ages of about, 3 till 7, I think it was. And I can just, remember seeing, tanks and stuff, charging around, and it just seemed pretty glamorous. And then when I went through, selection and everything else, tanks seemed the thing that appealed to me. And yeah, it's just one of those things. I can't really put my finger on it. But as I always say to my infantry mates, I spent 23 years, in the army, and did lots of exercises and operations on tanks, and I was never uncomfortable. And I listened to some of my infantry. I remember in Canada, listening to an infantry battle group attack, and the weather was horrendous, and the guys were getting hypothermia and all the rest of it, and we were sat, with brews in the tank, feeling pretty balmy. So yeah, it just fell in that way.
Yeah, I can only imagine the impression that would make on you seeing armoured vehicles at a young age. Because, I feel that way now when I see armoured vehicles. So if you were a kid seeing those, I can see how that would become ingrained in you. I want to ask your opinion on something that I like to ask people on the podcast is, do you think that you were born with something in you that led you towards joining the military, or do you think it was just where you were brought up and who you were brought up with, or is it something intrinsic?
That's a great question. I think it was probably the environment. I think every young boy and girl has the ability to be in the military, be in the army, or one of the other services. I think I think it's the military that made me. I don't. It's a brilliant way of life, and I've got so many mates. I joined 4RTR. We recruited from Glasgow. There is me, a sort of Surrey Highlander, and some of my best mates now are the troopers who joined at the same time as me. We came completely different ends of the spectrum. These are guys who grew up in the roughest areas of Glasgow. And I now include as some of my greatest mates. But it's the army that brought us together. And I think the mutual respect that you get from that, and you grow together. So I think it was probably my environment. I sort of think anybody can be trained. If you've got a bit of steel in you, and you've got a bit of grit, then you can make it. Maybe the great soldiers are just born, as it were. I don't know, but I think my environment, I sort of lived and breathed the military because that's what I knew from, my first memories. And pretty much until 10 years ago when I left, that's all I had. And my wife always used to say, you spent your life in an institution.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's, I always thought it would be a challenge leaving. And it's been an interesting challenge, certainly.
It's breaking up like a relationship, really. Someone that doesn't want you anymore because you're too old, and it's basically what it boils down to. When you got to the to your unit, what kind of tanks were you using there? Was it the Challenger ones or?
No, it's Chieftain.
Wow. Okay, we're going way back. Okay, youngsters listening now, you got to go and Google Chieftain and have a look what they look like. And where were you based? Were you out in Germany, or was it in the UK, or where were you getting to in those early days?
Yeah, we were in Germany, in Osnabrück, Infall Kaserne, and it was very, very strange for me. I think joining a Scottish regiment and being on Chieftains, which they had a Leyland bus engine.
Right.
Remarkably unreliable, but it was a shock. I mean, it was great fun. It was quite a hard life. You grew up very quickly.
I imagine then when you were in Germany, then your training and everything would have been geared towards the Soviet, like the war with the Soviet Union. So I suppose you got a CBRN education at a very young, very very early age. Can you just explain to people first of all what CBRN is and then also like the kind of the warfare that you were looking at that in those early days?
Well, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it was very much the Cold War, and our job, our tanks was to go and sit on the border and do what we could to keep back the marauding Eastern hordes. But CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. It used to be called NBC, nuclear, biological, and chemical. That was we were trained to fight in this environment. It was thought that the Soviets would use chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons, and you were trained to survive long enough to be able to take them on. But it was in those early days that I sort of, at the time, I was sitting in my tank in what we call 4 Romeo. You'll remember, you've got your respirator on, your gas mask, you've got your NBC suit, and God knows what else. And if you can imagine sitting in a tank, wearing all this kit, trying to look through a sight, at the time I thought that was bonkers. We had no way that we would survive. And actually, I've been a great advocate, since my time in Syria and working with the Peshmerga in northern Iraq. These things have got to be avoided. It's ridiculous trying to fight. And you remember from your tours in Iraq and everybody who's been to Iraq and Afghanistan, when it's 40 degrees centigrade, you're wearing your body armor and helmet, then you're expected to put a respirator on and all the rest of it. Yeah, it's barking. But it was a profound thing at the time. We thought the Soviets would use chemical weapons. And, to be frank, I think if there was a East-West confrontation now, I don't think the Russians would think twice about it. And of course, they used, nerve agent in Salisbury, where I'm talking to you from just over 2 years ago. My
chemical, the 4 Romeo experience when I was my first real one with it was on the Cambrian Patrol as part of that, and I decided very early on in my army career that I was just shooting myself the first day that there was any kind of nuclear or biological chemical attack. It's absolutely disgusting. I have friends that were involved in the invasion of Iraq, and obviously they had to go through a lot of that, and it's almost impossible even if you've been in that heat, you forget how hot these places are very quickly. You can almost not get. It's very hard to get your head around just how miserable it is to be living inside a rubber suit in these places. But no, I agree with you as well. I think we have a certain moral compass in the UK where we think that people are going to behave a certain way, and then we have to look to the evidence, as you say. Like, they have used chemical weapons, and also they are on the side in Syria, which we will come to more. They are on the side of the side using chemical weapons. So I think you're dead right. I think it'd be absolutely ridiculous of us and very dangerous for us to assume otherwise. Operational deployments. Then you were involved in the first Gulf War.
Yeah, that's right. I was a young captain, and actually I'd been in Battus in Canada, came back early, and I saw on the adjutant's desk before everybody else got back that 1420th Hussars just down the road needed a couple of extra officers. So I literally screwed up the note, chucked it in the bin, went to the armory, picked up my weapon, and drove down to Munster and sort of pulled my tabs into the adjutant, say, I'm here for, I'm the officer that you requested from 4RTR.
Brilliant.
And that was it. And then I was the squadron, what they call it, the squadron liaison officer in a ferret scout car. And we were part of 4 Brigade, so we were quite late to the party. We didn't get to Saudi until I think it was November, December, and then straight out into the desert. So yeah, it was just grabbing the initiative. Everybody, when you're a young boy or girl in the military, you just want to get out and get on operations. So yeah, I made sure that from 4RTR that was going to be me.
Are ferret scouts cars those things that look like they're about the size of a ride-on lawnmower, and you have like 2 people in them?
Well, yeah, slightly bigger.
I would not be wanting to go onto a battlefield in one of those, so I admire your balls.
Bizarrely, they're very well armoured, and they've got a Jaguar engine, so it was pretty good. I mean, my ferret could do about 55 miles an hour, which, when you think that was 2 or 3 times faster than a tank, because the regiment had Challenger 1s out there, it was pretty good. And actually, it's bizarre. I think your first operational combat experience has such an imprint on you. I remember the first few minutes of the war. I thought everybody was firing at me, and I kept getting the driver to move us around the battlefield. He was a Glaswegian called Booby Johnson. He just said, for Christ's sake, sir, get a grip. And then I had a bizarre experience. 10 years ago, I was at an army drinks party in Germany, and this guy came up to me and he said, Hamish, will you ever forgive me? And I went, forgive you for what? He said, well, I shot you in the first Gulf War. And I'd completely forgotten. He was our forward observation officer in a Warrior armoured vehicle. And at one point during the 4 days, in the middle of the night, he'd mistaken me for an enemy tank and had fired 20 rounds from his chain gun that hit the turret of my of the ferret. And luckily, it all bounced off. The only damage was a couple of water jerry cans were smashed, and my sleeping bag was riddled with holes. But I'd completely forgotten about it, for 20 years. It's bizarre.
It's funny, like there's something like that for a lot of people would be like the story of their life, wouldn't it? And then when you've amassed as much as you have, and then obviously that's why there's a book. It's just it's crazy. Like a lot of stories that soldiers just take for granted and forget are what would be the stuff of most people's kind of like the one pub talk that everybody has. What did you find like? What was your, you said like your first experience of it then? Because I mean, I wasn't there, and I don't want to generalize, but from what I can understand, it was quite a one-sided slog there. Did you feel in danger at all? Did you feel excited? Was it was it all kind of one-way traffic?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And I think your first combat is, it sits in the back of your mind. I mean, there were a couple of events that really stood out for me. I mean, the first one, and it was a CBRN one.
Right.
When we were expecting, we thought Saddam Hussein was going to use chemical. And you may remember from the history, lots of Scud missiles were fired at the coalition forces. And we anticipated these would be full of sarin nerve agent. Mm. And the first one that came near us in the desert before we'd crossed the berm into Kuwait, all the detectors went off. We were putting on our respirators and all the rest of it. Now I put my respirator on, and the valves in it didn't work. I couldn't breathe, and it was just panic. And I tell this in the book because, my first experience of CBRN was almost my last. And after that incident, I sort of vowed I'm not getting near any of this bloody stuff ever again. And then, of course, the rest of my life was sort of spent doing that. So that was really profound. And then when we were with the we were with the Royal Scots Battle Group, when an A10 took out two of their warriors and killed a number of soldiers, and I was probably, I don't know, 700 meters away from that, and that was a real shock. And I remember going into the battle group headquarters that night, and the CO talking to the guys. A number of people have been killed, and it was, we've got to get on. We'll mourn these people and everything else when it's all over. And I was just thinking, leadership is about, getting people to do things that they wouldn't naturally do. And in this case, we were all feeling, pretty glum, as you would do. And that was a thing where you've just got to get out of the trench and keep on going. And that had a sort of profound effect on me, I think, for the rest of my life. That, you have just got to keep on going, however bad things are. If you stop and give up, then, your adversary, the enemy, is won.
Yeah, absolutely. Just made me think then I remember, like, when I first came into the army, there was a very kind of negative feeling about American air power because of incidents like that. And I think that, for myself and I know yourself, you were out in Afghanistan in 2008 for a lot of the Afghanistan veterans out here. We fucking love A10s. There's nothing we love more than an A10. And I think, but like, yeah, I can definitely remember this feeling when I first joined around 2000 that it was like, oh, watch out for the Yanks, they'll just come and fucking shoot your vehicles up. And I think Afghanistan's kind of flipped that one on its head, and we all are very appreciative of that air power now. You must have seen an incredible scale of destruction on that first tour. Was that something? How did that affect you? Was that kind of staggering to behold?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, going back to the American air power, yeah, it's phenomenal. And as you say, it saved thousands of lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there were blue on blues, and these things happen in war. We all try absolutely all we can to prevent them, but. We had a blue on blue incident in Iraq, first Gulf War, where we fired at the echelon of the artillery brigade. By everything had been done to try and prevent that. These things, do happen. But the level of destruction was phenomenal. We got to the Basra Road, which you may remember is where the retreating Iraqi army was pretty much obliterated. And that was pretty shocking. And I think, there was a lot of death and destruction. And, the average Iraqi soldier was, they didn't want to be there. They were forced to be there. They were purely cannon fodder. And I think, that had a pretty profound effect on me too. But yeah, as you know, in this business, destruction, once the president, prime minister, king or queen presses that button and unleashes the military, then that is what it's all about. We just have to try and make absolutely certain that we're doing it is the right thing to do for the right reasons. And with 2003 there've been some issues, and I profoundly feel that we've done that. We haven't done the right thing in Syria, but war is a phenomenally difficult, dangerous and bloody game.
Yeah, and as you say, with the blue on blue, it is an inevitable part on war, and like in the instances that we've just talked about, it's if an A10 makes a mistake, someone will die. If luckily, if someone behind the warrior chain gun makes a mistake, you might be able to get away with it. But these things will happen, and it's something that anybody listening who's involved in the military or the police, law enforcement, anything like that, it's something that you need to train for, with putting yourself in the most chaotic environments over and over again, because it will come up. Nothing will come to plan. So what was next for you then, Hamish? What was the what was the thing from there? Because I have here in my notes that you went in. So we're talking 1991 there, and then you went to Iraq in 2008.
Yeah.
So what? So we're looking at a pretty long career here. So what were kind of some of the highlights of your army career over that time? I'm flying through this, but I really want to get onto the serious stuff. And you've got a book, so people can go and buy the bloody book. This isn't the audio book, so they can go and get that.
No, absolutely right. And I'll sort of fly through it. Then came back as a young officer. I did a tour in Bosnia, which was phenomenally interesting, but fairly short. I was very, very fortunate to get selected to go to the Australian Army Staff College. So we went to live in Australia for a year, and which was just brilliant. I mean, it probably didn't help my future career. I perhaps should have stayed in the UK, but my highlight of Australia is I played semi-professional Aussie rules football.
Oh, fantastic!
Which was I was a pretty reasonable rugby player, but there was no rugby, and we were living near Melbourne there. So somebody said, "Why didn't you play Aussie rules?" And I did, and I eventually got picked, but it was for a professional team. And I think I was only there because I was a POM, and they liked the idea. Is a bloody POM, isn't he useless? But I loved it. We had a brilliant time, and that was great. When I came back from there, I commanded a tank squadron, G squadron, and one RTR, Challenger 1, and we actually did a UN tour to Cyprus, which was dismounted, and then. After that, I was 2IC of 2 RTR in Challenger 2, and then got promoted, and then became CO of the CBRN regiment, which sort of takes us up to really where the book kicks off, with activities in Iraq, and then Afghanistan.
So let's talk about Iraq then. I suppose my question to you as CEO of the CBRN regiment is: was there WMD, and if so, where are they? And what was your? You obviously had a very probably a great insight into what was going on at the time, the reasons behind the invasion, and all that kind of thing. Can you talk us through like what were the concerns, and what actually transpired to be correct, and what was transpired to be incorrect?
Well, this could be a podcast in itself. But I think the reason we went to war in 2003 was the WMD, and your listeners will remember the dodgy dossier. Now, it turned out that there wasn't much WMD about. A lot of it had been collected by the UN, and in 1996 was all put in a place called Al Mathana, north of Baghdad. Now, that became important a lot later because a so-called Islamic State broke into Al Mathana in 2016 and nicked some of the chemical weapons and used them against the Peshmerga, which
Jesus Christ.
So there was that, but there wasn't really much. What we were doing in the CBRN regiment, there was quite a lot of legacy munitions from the Iran-Iraq war and elsewhere. And I tell the story of one chap in Al-Amara, the town north of Basra, who used to produce a sarin rocket every month. And the Americans paid $20,000 for a sarin rocket. And then we went off and blew it up in the desert. And so it wasn't really the fact that in my sort of two or so years commanding the regiment, this fellow probably handed in 20 or 25 and made a nice packet out of it. But there wasn't wholesale. What there was is legacy munitions, which Al-Qaeda quite often used as improvised explosives devices, IEDs, whether on purpose or not. And Al-Qaeda also used to blow up chlorine tankers, which Islamic State did against the Peshmerga much later. So there wasn't a sort of WMD as envisaged, but there was quite a lot of legacy stuff still knocking around that we dealt with. And I tell in the book a story about we had a biological sensor system covering the British AO in southern Iraq, and one day that alarmed for anthrax, and that brought operations to a standstill until we'd sorted it out, because we thought we were on the whether it was Al-Qaeda or whoever else was attacking us with anthrax. Anthrax is a very deadly pathogen. has a 95% mortality rate unless you get treatment. And there were only a few of us in theatre at the time who'd had the anthrax vaccine. And that was pretty profound for me, but we managed to sort that out. So that was pretty much Iraq. And then after I'd finished commanding, I then did a tour in Afghanistan.
What was it? What was it took you out to Afghanistan? Is your career path, once you'd gone down this kind of CBRN route, were you on quite a kind of a linear career path in terms of like CBRN at that point? Had you kind of become like that was the hat that you were wearing for the rest of your army career as such?
Well, it pretty much will, and you'll understand it. I was hoping that I'd command a tank or a cavalry regiment. So when it was a CBRN regiment, that a lot of my mates were going, unlucky DBG, and I did for a bit, but then I actually sort of realised this was really quite interesting stuff. So I was earmarked a little bit with that, but actually I went to Afghanistan in an intelligence role. But when I was there, we then had this issue with all these chemicals from the drugs industry, and an organisation called the British Embassy Drugs Team, which was a euphemism for MI6, came up to me one night and said, "We believe you're the world's expert in chemical weapons. We've got an issue." And I sort of go, "No, mate, I'm the assistant intelligence officer here." And they go, "No, you're Colonel DBG, aren't you? You just finished commanding the CBRN regiment." I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Well, our records show you're it, mate. We've got this problem." And we then had to deal with this massive sort of what would have been a fertilizer bomb and deal with that. So that was slightly accidental. And again, when I left the army, I sort of stumbled back into CBRN bizarrely through the media, because a lot of the guys running security for people like the BBC and other media organisations are all ex-military, and one of them said to me, "Look, DBG, can you go and sort of look after a team going into Syria to cover a chemical weapons attack?" And that got me going again on the whole CBRN side.
Coming on to Syria then, this is a situation that obviously unfolded. A lot of people weren't really aware of what was going on in Syria, even until really ISIS kind of came onto the stage. When did you become aware of what was happening there, and when did you become worried about the potential use of chemical weapons in that part of the world?
Well, the Arab Spring in Syria sort of started in 2011. In 2012, there was indications that the Syrian government might start using chemical weapons. And that's really when I sort of began to get involved. I'd actually been working with the Kurdistan government in northern Iraq. They'd asked me to go and help them decontaminate Halabja, where there was a massive chemical attack back in 1988. And there was quite a lot of linkages between the various Kurds, the Iraqi Kurds, the Syrian Kurds. So I knew that the Syrian Kurds were getting concerned that Assad would use chemical weapons. But it was then early in 2013, in fact, March 2013, there was a reported chemical attack in a place called Sheikh al-Masud, which is a suburb of Aleppo. And CBS News got in touch with me and said, "Look, Hamish, we think there might be a chemical attack. Can you help our crew and advise?" So I then got involved with that, and it transpired that there was a sarin attack, and it was very evident. I started telling people in the British government that it was happening, and others, and they're going, "Well, there's no evidence," and all the rest of it. So then we sort of realised that we'd have to try and collect evidence. Now, at the time, the Syrian government were not party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Therefore, in theory, the international community could do nothing about it. We then had another chemical attack in a place called Sarakeb in May 2013, and the BBC asked me to go out to the border and help with their reporting of it. And there, with Ian Pannell, their Middle East reporter, we covered the story. And this was the first time I tried to get some samples. And the book goes into great detail, which I won't hear, but we tried to get samples and failed. But actually, the samples that we'd packaged up somehow managed to find their way back to the UK and the US. And you may not remember it, but in in July 2013, the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, did say in the House of Commons, we have compelling evidence that Assad is using chemical weapons. And I sort of feel, at least, that evidence that I had my DNA on it, although we didn't quite get it. And then the massive chemical attack happened on the 21st of August, 2013, where, up to 1,700 people were killed. Sarin, probably, half a ton of sarin was used. And by then I was advising an organization called OSAM, which was the Union of Syrian Medical Charities. And they were pretty much running all the hospitals and clinics in the rebel-held areas. And in our clinic in Ghouta, on the morning of the 21st of August, we had 9 doctors treating casualties, and 7 of them died from cross-contamination.
7 of the doctors?
Yeah. And that to me was shocking. And still, the world was not, sort of onto this. But, so many civilians died because, they had no way of protecting themselves. So I then started running webinars into Syria, teaching people what to do and how to, protect themselves if they had nothing. And we set up something called the CBRN Task Force. And the CBRN Task Force really configured hospitals to treat chemical casualties, but also trained people to collect evidence, because without the evidence, nobody was going to do anything. You might remember back in August 2012, President Obama said there's a red line. If you use chemical weapons, you'll get hammered. But then Ghouta happened a year later, and nothing happened because people weren't convinced about the evidence. So the CBRN Task Force was set up to do that. And we've been collecting evidence ever since. And, I'm delighted that a lot of our evidence has been the evidence that has been acted on by the British and American, French and other governments. But still, Assad continued to use chemical weapons because, we might have acted on it, but we haven't done anything demonstrative to stop him using them.
Guys, so much to go into here. One of the things I think we should talk about, I don't want to be gory for the sake of being gory, but one of the things that's so easy to do as human beings is we hear a number like 1,700 people and we think, oh, that's terrible. But we just kind of imagine these people just lying down in a cloud and dying, which I imagine is not the case. And I think it's very, I think that's part of the issue with why we've let this stuff slide as Britain and America, is because, we can ignore the very nasty kind of actual effects. So can you tell us what sarin is and how it works, and and why it is such a horrible weapon of war, or why it shouldn't be a weapon of war?
Well, I think absolutely you put your finger on it. First of all, chemical weapons are completely indiscriminate. So it's one thing firing a bullet at an opposing enemy. It's another just covering a place with chemical weapons. And I think, so mostly women and children die because actually, the soldiers in Syria, a lot of them have gas masks, so they whack them on and they survive. I think the real horror with chemical weapons is they say drowning is the worst way to go. And sort of with chemical weapons, in effect, you sort of drown because most of them act on your main sort of bodily functions, your lungs, your heart, and stop them working. And sarin is a nerve agent, and basically it destroys your nerves. And without your nerves, your lungs don't work, your heart doesn't work. And for me, it's been very profound. I mentioned that I was diagnosed with something called sudden cardiac death syndrome, which is a very rare heart condition that generally affects, elite sportsmen. But when I was diagnosed, that the initial bit of it, when you have a heart attack, the thing with me was you just couldn't breathe, and it seemed slightly counterintuitive. And I was with the Peshmerga in 2016 when so-called Islamic State fighters fired chlorine mortars at us. So I've seen it at close up, and psychologically, it's absolutely horrific. But I think that the main thing is, these are dreadful weapons. For almost 100 years after the First World War, they weren't used. As people, even Hitler didn't. I mean, he murdered millions of Jews using chemicals in concentration camps, but he never used chemical weapons on the battlefield. And it wasn't really until the Iran-Iraq War and then Syria that chemical weapons are used. And I think absolutely abhorrent. It's a bit like the barrel bombs in Syria, which are these massive barrels full of rusty nails that are tipped out of a helicopter at about 3,000 feet, and just kill everything in sight. Again, completely indiscriminate. And I think that's the indiscriminate is why they're so abhorrent, and the death is just it is shocking, and it kills far more women and children and civilians than it does combatants.
It's very telling that America didn't drop chemical weapons on Japan, but they did drop nuclear weapons. I mean, that goes to show there was something about how how horrible people feel that these weapons are. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but they were quite commonplace in the First World War. But then, like you said, it's not something I've ever come across. Reading memoirs and things about the Second World War, it's not something I've ever come across. And like you said, for Hitler not to use it, because again, I don't, with the caveat, yes, he did use it in the camps, but the war on the East was about as brutal as you can get. So you would have thought that they would have used it there. But it's very interesting that they wouldn't do that. What's your thinking? The reasons behind that? Was it? Do you think is because they feared the retaliation for it, or was it just really that they that there was some kind of moral line that they didn't want to cross?
Well, I don't think there was any moral line. You're right; they were used a lot in the First World War, and very effective. A lot of people report that Hitler didn't use them because he thought that if he used them, the West would use nuclear. And he thought the West was way ahead of him in nuclear terms. So he was hoping to avoid any CBRN use at all in the Second World War because he thought he could win without it. But he thought if it came to a chemical and nuclear battle, he would lose. So I think that seems pretty plausible to me. I think what has struck me since is that actually chemical weapons, are morbidly brilliant. If you've got no morals or scruples, you would use them. And I personally believe Assad is still in power because he has used them. I mean, the big attack in Ghouta 7 years ago, he was about to fall. Lots of my Syrian friends who were in Damascus at the time were saying Assad was on his way out. So he thought, well, this is the last throw of the dice.
Yep.
And he took a gamble, and his gamble was right because, first of all, the British government decided not to punish him for using chemical weapons, and then the Americans did. And then, 7 years later, he's still in power. Another 500,000 people are dead. And whenever he's been in real trouble, he's used chemical weapons. And, we haven't prevented that happening.
Absolutely. He was on the ropes. And, personally, as a former British soldier and as a British citizen, I've been disgusted with the way that we've handled Syria, absolutely disgusted. Can you talk about the Obama's red line, and can you talk about how we essentially set up this kind of we set this up and then backed away from it, and what the reasons were, and then the kind of the implications of not kind of seeing through our promises?
Back in September 2012, Obama said his great statement about the use of chemical weapons would cross a red line, and they would act. When we had the Ghouta attack in September of that year, there was a vote in Parliament, and I was there. I was in Parliament. I'd been lobbying MPs and ministers, saying, I've had first-hand experience. This is shocking. This has happened. But also at the time, and you may have seen it all over social media, there are all these trolls and bots who spurt out all this propaganda and disinformation, predominantly coming from the Russians and the Syrians,
Russian bots.
saying that it didn't happen. And it absolutely did. And in the vote in Parliament, I think much to the chagrin of Ed Miliband, who was the then Labour MP, he decided, Labour leader, he decided to make a political issue of this, and he made his people vote against Britain taking action. And I think, David Cameron's speech in the debate was pretty light, pretty pathetic. And I was infuriated. I just couldn't believe that people were backing down. And in the end, the British government voted not to take action. The next day, the Americans had a similar vote, and I was commentating on it for Sky, and I said, I can't believe this. But President Obama, with his closest ally pulling out, decided to pull out too. And that to me was, we then, every despot, rogue state, and terror group then thought, right, chemical weapons, they're back on the agenda, and they have been. We've seen them being used by so-called Islamic State. We've seen them be used by North Korea in the VX murder in Kuala Lumpur, and we've seen the Russians use them on the streets of Salisbury. And I think chemical weapons are the ultimate terror weapon. Terrorists. There's a brilliant biography called 9 Lives by a fellow called Eamon Dean.
Absolutely love it. One of my favorite books.
Well,
love it.
Eamon, as you know, was a double agent for many years for us inside Al Qaeda. And in fact, we worked out that we were a few miles away in Bosnia back in 1995.
Really? When he was so for people that don't know, he was fighting with the G. Well, they weren't. I suppose it was jihadis, but not in the way that we really think of it now. They were almost like they were kind of nice jihadis.
Well, I think
in a way.
But Eamon went on to be Al Qaeda's chemical weapons expert.
Yeah, he did. But it's a great book, great book. But buy Chemical Warrior first, listeners, and then buy 9 Lives by Eamon Dean.
No, absolutely. So. What the point was is that the Al Qaeda and ISIS, these ultimate terror weapons, that's exactly what they want. They want to create terror and cause mayhem, and they've seen what's happened in Syria. They've seen the impact of the Salisbury, quarter of an egg cup of Novichok fixated the world for 18 months. And although COVID is not a biological weapon, it is illustrating what if a terror group could release, a virus, a pathogen, a deadly pathogen, the impact they could have. And, that I think that all stems back to, the red line crossing, that we didn't absolutely stamp on it. And we part of my sort of moving forward is to try and highlight these things, which, as I said, is one of the reasons for writing the book. To say we can't brush this under the carpet. I accept it's very difficult. We must strain every nerve and sinew to rid the world of chemical and biological weapons.
I feel like that vote and that moment in history will be judged in the same way as our inaction in Rwanda. It was like it was political expediency to step away from it. It was a hard decision, absolutely, but to do nothing then, like he's just. It opened the doors, and one wonders. I mean, we'll never know. One wonders, like what were Russia saying behind the doors at that point, because it really changed the face of what was going on in Syria and that region at that point. And I just feel like, as British citizens and British soldiers, that we it's not our greatest moment, absolutely. And I think that if we are to be the country that we want to be the nation that we want to be, then It's the equivalent of seeing your neighbor beat the shit out of his wife and just close the blinds and pretend that it's not happening. It's just it's not on. It must be incredibly hard for you to see that, knowing what's going on there, and know that there's something that we can do about it and not do it. Like, how do you keep a lid on? Like, how do you walk the line between being a advocate for action against this stuff and policing this thing, and not throttling a politician.
That's a really good point, and I think a lot of our inactivity in Syria goes back to Iraq 2003, and I think politicians admit they got that wrong and they didn't want to repeat it. But I kept saying to a lot of the politicians, I spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, is different. But I think we have a lot of very unworldly, inexperienced politicians now. I mean, at one point I was tempted to become a politician. I've not rather naively thought that the 650 best men and women in the country were MPs and running the country. I then got to know a lot of them and realised that's just not the case. But I then realised I was more interested than trying to help the good people of Syria than perhaps the good people of Dorset and Wiltshire who I'd be representing. And I realised that was probably wrong. But it is a challenge, and I know that one shouts and screams at these things, and there are lots of other things going in the world, and there are huge amounts of challenges, and it does get frustrating. But a couple of stories I tell in the book of young kids I've seen who've been killed, and it was one little girl who was caught in a barrel bomb blast, and we were trying to get her across the border, and she sort of died there and then. And I just thought, it was pretty shocking, and very sad. And her parents probably didn't even know what happened, if she had any, and that was pretty profound. And then I was in Syria last year, and just after I'd been diagnosed with prostate cancer, and actually I got the call from my oncologist while I was in Syria, and I was feeling pretty sorry for myself. And I was in a hospital in Idlib, and there was a little boy who was sat on a bench, and he didn't have any legs, and he had one arm, and he was wired up to a load of machines. I didn't know what they were, and I subsequently learned he'd been caught in a Syrian airstrike 3 weeks beforehand, and I was obviously looking, like thunder, and I caught him out of the corner of my eye, and I saw his sort of mouth twitching, and then sort of smile appeared, and then a massive grin. I sort of went, God, bloody hell, DBG, get yourself together. This boy, he couldn't have been more than 2, maybe 3 years old. He had one limb left, and he was smiling. So those sort of things, I think, just keep you going, and just force you, so it's every nerve and sinew just to keep going and try and help them, because not a lot of people are. There are a lot of my medical and doctor friends, like Professor David Knott, and a lot of the Syrian doctors who I mentioned in the book, just do an amazing job. But in places like Washington DC and Whitehall, it's a secondary concern. And when you've been there, that's a shock. But I realise, particularly during the COVID thing, everybody wants to get us all sorted out here at home. But I can tell you, in Idlib, it's a shocking state with COVID. But then, it's a lot of the international community want to sort themselves out first, and I get that absolutely.
Yeah, again, there's just so much to go into here. I mean, one of the things, I just want to commend you, Hamish, for what you do, because not everyone, myself included, could go over and stand up to seeing those kind of things. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I got a tear in my eye now thinking about those kids. It's just absolutely terrible. And again, it just makes me want to throttle some people, because I just figured if 1 or 2 people from each party had gone over there and actually seen with their own eyes what was going on, then there might not be another 500,000 people dead now. And it's not the people in the ivory towers it's not Assad that pays the price, is it? It's fucking kids. And like I said, I just feel like we should be ashamed as a country for our lack of action in this. I really do. I don't think history is going to judge us kindly on it. But I mean, the great thing about it, if there is a great thing in it, is that there are, like you said, the story about that kid, and, there's just, it's really shows the best sides of humanity as well as the first one, as cliche as that sounds. But the thing with yours, when you learned that you had prostate cancer, I wondered, did that Did that almost make you have a kind of like a bit of reckless abandon with your life at that point? Because obviously, you're putting yourself in some dangerous positions here. And I'm not sure what's your situation. Do you have family? What were you kind of thinking? Like, how did that conversation go in your head about deciding, like, when you're kind of confronting your mortality on so many different fronts at the same time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's more easy to explain it to fellow veterans. I mean, my wife's view was, when I left the military, I'd done tours. These are 6-month tours, so nipping off for a few weeks to Syria was, not such a big issue. Although, I did the first time. The first time I went to Syria, I told my wife I was going to do some training in Greece, and somebody said to her, "Hey, I've just seen Hamish on the BBC in Syria." And she said, "No, you can't be. He's in Greece doing some training." And I said, "Oh, crikey, yeah." So there was a bit of that. I mean, I consider myself to be incredibly fortunate. My sudden cardiac death syndrome, it should have killed me, but it's one of these things, when you know about it, you can do something about it. So I take a pill which sort of prevents my heart from beating itself to pieces. But you might remember the footballer Fabrice Muamba and the cricketer who, and virtually any young child you hear dies on a sports pitch. It's from this.
Right.
So again, and with the prostate cancer, I was fortunate. I had it checked, and there are lots of different types of prostate cancer. Mine happens to be the very slow-growing one, so it just sort of needs to be checked. But with any of these things, when the cancer word is mentioned or the heart word, you go, God, bloody hell. What for me, it galvanizes you. Let's make the most of. I get a bit cross to my kids if they're moaning or being a bit idle. I say cross. I say, come on, think of those kids in Syria. Get off your arse and do something. But for me, it's been galvanizing, and I, the book is, I hope it's not, any sort of self glorification, because it's absolutely not meant to be. But it's highlighting these issues, and somebody suggested that I do it. I think most of us veterans sort of think that there's nothing particularly special about what we do, and lots of people have been in the same boat. But I suppose actually, we have lived slightly different lives, and if we can have a voice for good, then that's something that we should do, and that's certainly the way that I felt, because it's not been particularly easy producing the book, and I know a lot of friends and family are going to go, "Ooh, crikey, didn't know you did that," sort of thing. But anyway, hopefully it's a force for good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we should be honest that one of the things in the military is, as great as we can be at supporting each other in some things, we can cut each other down in others. And one of the things like that is, who does this person think he is doing a book? And I'm speaking from experience here as someone who's done a book about the military. But it's like, look, at the end of the day, if people don't speak up, then the stories of the people that you worked with get forgotten over time. And I don't think anybody wants us that. So I think it's very important to put these out there, especially a book like this that has so much to important things. Because the thing is, Syria is an open wound. This is still going on. This isn't something that happened 40 years ago, which has been resolved. This is fucking happening now. These attacks are happening now. I want to say, this is the first time I've ever said this on the podcast, I want to talk about your prostate. One of the things I want to talk about is because I think this is a young man thing in general. We don't like to think of ourselves as being vulnerable to these kind of things. How can people get checked for this kind of thing? How often should they get checked? And also, one of the things, just to tie this into someone we had on the podcast recently, apparently, if you've been in Iraq, if you've been in Afghanistan, and if you've been exposed to burn pits, there is a higher chance of you getting these diseases earlier than you would do if you'd lived a life without the exposure to those kind of toxins and things. So it's something to be aware of as well, that if you have been around those burn pits, I know a lot of us have, that this is something that, it might say on the paperwork you shouldn't have this until a certain stage in your life, but like there have been veterans passing away from cancers a lot younger than they should be.
You're absolutely right, and we don't really know, but it's with all these things, it's much better, to get it checked out. I mean, sometimes it's a bit difficult, and particularly for us blokes, it's something that doesn't come naturally. I mean, I would say, and again, this isn't gospel, but mostly, I'm 50 plus. Prostate mostly affects people over 50, but most prostate cancers are very treatable. So it's a simple blood test that they can very quickly work out if once you're what they call it's your PSA level, and I can't quite remember what the acronym stands for, but if that's as a certain level, you then get other tests. And I was fortuitous. I was a reasonably sort of well-paid executive a few years ago, and it was part of the deal that you had an annual MOT, as it were, and one of those a year ago showed that up. But it's very much it's a hereditary thing as well. So if any of your close family have had it, you should definitely get it checked out. As with some of these other diseases, so with prostate, it's just a fact of life. Get it checked, and most of the time these things are very, very treatable. We're just not very good at looking after ourselves sometimes, and I expect my kids are much better. My son's much more sort of aware of these sort of things than I was at his age. But it's you just have to bite the bullet and get on with it.
Yeah, the paras we have listening to the podcast are all shaking their heads because they're very used to checking their own prostates. So no danger on that side of things. So you're saying that it's really galvanized you then. So would you say that in life we almost have to go through something that really exposes our mortality for us to actually fully actualize our lives?
I don't know. I think everybody is different, and some people are more motivated than others. But I do. Life is all about experiences, and what you see in the military, what you see in the battlefield, what you see in war zones. If it doesn't affect you, then crikey, you're some kind of person. So it's I think what is important is that you make something of it. I think about the little girl who died and the little boy without any limbs. I think his legacy and her legacy is, it's got to mean something. It's got to get us to do things. And it might sound a bit crass, but some of our politicians, I'd like to lead them through the streets of, Aleppo and Sarakeb, and, show them what the real world's about. And they might, that might stimulate them. And there's some very brilliant politicians on all sides of the house in the government, but it just strikes me a lot of them haven't got a lot of life's experiences. And although there are quite a lot of veterans, in Parliament, I don't know what the figure is, but who are good. It's nothing like after the Second World War, 50% of politicians would have done some sort of military service and would have experience. Nowadays, there I don't know 20, 30, 40, veterans in Parliament out of 650. So there is not. I don't think there's sort of that understanding, and I don't know how you correct it, but I would like to think that people like you and I can have an impact. And in fact, a lot of people, when I said I wanted to be an MP, said, "Don't. You've got far more influence and effect from outside than being part of the machine, if you like."
All right, guys, we'll be back to the podcast in 1 second. I just want to say a huge thank you to the Royal British Legion, because without them, there is no podcast. Guys, they make it happen here. Believe me, and I'm being fully open here. Without the Royal British Legion, there wouldn't be a podcast. They make this financially viable. Basically, I'd like to be a lot richer than I am, but I'm not. And the Royal British Legion are covering costs for this podcast and helping it run. We really, really appreciate it. And they do a lot more than that, guys. They offer everything from financial assistance and advice to care homes. They've got it all going on. And one of the things that I love about the Royal British Legion so much is that they're not just interested in the day-to-day of our modern lives. They are interested in keeping alive the memories of those who have gone before us, which is so fucking important. It's one of the things we want to do here on the podcast, and the Royal British Legion do it so well. They do it through, obviously, the events that they organise. Not so much of those at the moment, unfortunately, due to COVID, but there is still a lot going on online, and you can find it all at rbl.org.uk or at Royal British Legion. I'll tag them up in everything, guys. Just follow the links in the notes, follow the links on my social media posts, and you'll find them on there. They're doing a lot of work to keep the sacrifices remembered, and we all say it, don't we? We will remember them, and we must remember them. The Royal British Legion are a huge part of that, so please go and give them a follow. All right, guys, thanks for listening. Let's get back to the podcast. Yeah, I agree with that, and I know some American veterans who are thinking along the same lines as you, who are going in it or who were in it, who are now coming out of it, because the machine is almost so set in its ways now that you can get more done outside of it. Because I'm sure there are a few politicians out there who are fighting the good fight, but it's just these. I think the problem is just. There's a lot on their plate, fair play to them. They have a lot on their plate, and it's easier to kind of like, you hear a number, you hear a figure. It's very hard to confront what that truth of 1,700 deaths means. What each one of those people, they weren't a number. They laughed at things, they got mad at things. They had dreams. They loved their parents. They loved their siblings. These were living, breathing human beings, not like a number on a report that they got. And I feel like our politicians owe it not just to to us, but to themselves as human beings to go to these places. And I think if just a few people from each party actually went and saw it, the message would get across. I just think they're so kind of devoid of reality. But that's not just politicians; that's just people in general. And it goes the other way as well. It's sometimes people are all too happy for us to get into a war. So we can go the other way as well, because it swings from one way to another. On the subject of war, not that I want this to be doom or gloom, but the reality is that I do think we are in it. I do think that we are in a very important time in history. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts right now, as it always is, but now feels especially kind of in the balance. What is the situation with the kind of like, I know you've talked about inactivity on the international stage, because, chemical weapons is something that is in nations' arsenals. And there's a lot of potential flashpoints around the world right now, a lot of them going on right under our nose. People aren't really we're familiar with. Actually, you know what, Hamish? One thing I want to just talk to you about really quick was you said you worked with the Peshmerga. Something I want to ask you is, on a personal level, how did it feel when we pulled out of, I say we, really America, but obviously I count our actions with them, pulled out of Kurdistan and kind of left the Kurds to the mercy of Turkey, and now that I've seen today that Turkey and Russia actually mount joint patrols in Erbil now and these kind of areas. So how did that make you feel on a personal level?
Well, I think there's they pulled out of northeast Syria, which is the Syrian Kurd area. In the Iraqi Kurd area, they weren't really there. But yeah, no, that was absolute shock. I mean, it seemed that Trump woke up one morning and thought that was a good idea. Luckily, a lot of the special forces guys hung around. But it was very, very difficult. And I think for the Kurds in northern Iraq, I mean, the Peshmerga, they were the main fighters on the ground who defeated Islamic State. And I got such admiration for them. During Saddam's time, Saddam murdered over 400,000 Kurds, a lot with chemical weapons. I mean, Britain did set up the no-fly zone in 1991, which saved thousands. My first trip to Kurdistan after I left the army, I met one of the ministers there. He said to me, Hamish, the two people I want to meet most in my life are Sir John Major and Tony Blair. And I said, crikey, you're in a pretty small class there.
I like to meet Tony Blair, but not for the same reasons.
And I said, why? He said, well, Sir John Major set up the no-fly zone that saved the Kurdish race. And Tony Blair organised the defeat of Saddam Hussein. So it was bizarre, but we very much have left them to their own devices. And when we didn't want to put boots on the ground to defeat ISIS in Syria and Iraq, actually it was the Peshmerga who, the Iraqi army were there as well. But everybody will tell you it's the Peshmerga who did, the hard yards, the hard fighting, who ultimately defeated Islamic State. So we owe them a tremendous amount. But our standing back now. Sure, we still do provide air power to take out Islamic State, but as you can't do it all from the air. You need people on the ground as well, and that's what we don't have. But we rely on the Kurds and others to do that. But we don't necessarily then, back them up with the support that they deserve.
Obviously, it's not our decision to make. But if it was your decision to make as a British soldier at the time, or former British soldier, do you think that we should have put boots on the ground, like as in real boots on the ground, not just special forces, for taking the fight to ISIS?
I think if we step back a bit, should we have struck Assad in August 2013 when he used chemical weapons? Mm-hmm. Yes, we absolutely should have done, and really, really hard. Because at that time, ISIS was just getting going. And when the Syrian people saw that the international community were going to allow this butcher to murder them, they then moved in their droves to Islamic State. And then that created Islamic State that then spread into Iraq and went on from there. So I think, we should have struck. Once the genie was out of the bottle, it then becomes more difficult. And I absolutely get that, the amount of British soldiers that were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, was unacceptable. But, I still, Afghanistan, a place I love and, spend a long time there. I still don't quite get why we spent so much time and effort there. The Taliban are never going to attack us in London. Yeah. But Islamic State are a threat. The other thing people don't realize, Syria is a Mediterranean country. I remember being on holiday in Turkey a few years ago, and somebody I met on the holiday had heard me on the radio or the BBC. And they said, oh, I gather you do a lot of stuff in Syria. And I said, yeah, do you know where Syria is? And they went, I don't know, miles away. I said, no, it's about half an hour over there. I mean, it is right on our doorstep. And if something had happened in Greece like this, would we have stood by and done nothing? We didn't in Bosnia and Kosovo and places like that. So I think people don't realise quite how close it is, and what happens there will have an impact. So, but going back to your question about boots on the ground to defeat ISIS, I personally believe had we thumped Assad back in 2013, then there wouldn't have been the requirement.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. I mean, they basically once you've had your bluff called in these places, people like they don't have as short memories as we do in the West. In the West, everything is done on election cycles and 4-year terms. I mean, there's people in Afghanistan who still remember what we did in the old in the Anglo-Afghan wars over 100 years ago. These places have long memories, and your word and your actions, they matter. What is what in terms of like big nation states, like the major states, who are the Who are the kind of leaders in the field of chemical weapons, and if there were, who is the biggest threats, and would you say over the next few years of using them?
Well, I think there are a number. You've got rogue states like North Korea, who we know have about 5,000 tons of VX, which is a really deadly nerve agent. And whether we also know they're trying to develop a nuclear warhead to go on the missiles that could reach the states. So I think the Americans actually in that case are keeping a very close touch on them. But what worries me about North Korean chemical weapons is that I think they'd very happily sell to groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. If they were offered several $1 million for some nerve agent, I'm sure they'd sell it, and that is a real concern. I think Russia is a huge concern. They very publicly declared in 2017 they got rid of all their chemical weapons. Mm-hmm. They now realise that they had a secret chemical weapons program developing Novichok, which is probably the most toxic chemical that's ever been produced on Earth. And in the unlikely event, I think it is unlikely that there is an East-West confrontation, I don't think the Russians would have a bat an eyelid about using chemical weapons. So therein, China, we know that China probably has large stockpiles. I think the way the Chinese have reacted to COVID is of huge concern. Their suppression of the data and intelligence for weeks in January really allowed COVID to spread around the world. And you could argue that China has been the least affected country in the world by COVID. And the whole COVID thing has shown to anybody who would want to do us harm, quite how effective biological pathogens can be. And then you've got terror groups. So we know from Ayman Dean that Al Qaeda did an awful lot of research and work into chemical and biological weapons. And we know that Islamic State did as well. Islamic State made their own mustard gas, and because of its horror effects, would like to use it. We then see, only last week, the Beirut explosion. That, in effect, ammonium nitrate is a toxic chemical, which was the basis of a lot of bombs that Taliban and Al Qaeda made in Afghanistan. So, you put all these things together and you build up a picture where in the past, people have not used chemical weapons because it was seen to be the ultimate taboo. But now, why not? There was a piece only a year ago with Islamic State jihadis trying to smuggle hydrogen sulfide onto a Etihad jet in Sydney, which would probably have brought the jet down. But it's all these little things sort of mount up, which is why, I think we must be absolutely demonstrative. The challenge is that whatever the UK, the US, and France sort of try and do, the Russians and the Chinese always try and oppose. So trying to get some international movement here going is pretty difficult, but we must try. And you can get the feeling that we sort of gave up in 2013 and haven't really got back on that particular horse, as it were.
Yeah, and as you were saying, what we've seen over the last 6 months or so, it makes you think if there was a something that was killing 10% of people, that a lot of Western countries would just fall in on themselves. In a lot of sense, it's got to be a very tempting weapon for a lot of these, especially like you said, these kind of like non-state actors. With Russia and their use of a chemical weapon in Salisbury, do you think that was almost a "we'll do what we fucking want, watch this" kind of moment? Because surely something like that is very detectable, and they would know that. So is it almost like a kind of two fingers up and in that kind of statesmanship?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Putin is the ultimate strategist, and mainly because he doesn't care. It's like all this disinformation that comes out. The Russians are happy to put out any rubbish Whereas, the British government, everything has to be double and triple checked and signed off, in the nth degree. So I think you're right. I think Salisbury was a bit of a two fingers. And Putin, had previously said anybody who double crosses the Russian state will be killed. And there are about 14 other deaths, associated around the Skripal poisoning of people who are either double agents or who openly opposed the Russian state. However, and we also know that Novichok was designed so it was undetectable by NATO detectors and overmatched our PPE, our protective equipment. But the actual assassination attempt itself was pretty amateur. These guys, maybe they were doing it on purpose or not, but I'm not sure. They were detected virtually from the minute they arrived in the UK to the minute they left, or were subsequently on all the CCTV. And of course, they didn't achieve their aim. Sadly, Dawn Sturgis was the only person who died, an innocent civilian, but Skripal and his daughter survived. But it was very much, I think, Putin, sort of flexing his muscles, because conventionally the Russians are no match for NATO, and Putin knows that. But using sort of asymmetric type weaponry, certainly they can do, and it was a pretty powerful statement. And apart from platitudes in the UN and elsewhere, we didn't really do much. If we then had the Russian Football World Cup. If we were really pissed off about this, we should have withdrawn the UK football team. But we didn't do that. We just cracked on and got on with it. So yeah, in the strategic world of international brinkmanship, Putin, is very much on the top table. And I think we appeared weak, and we need to, our politicians need to get a grip, particularly on things like this. We should have done something against Assad, and we should have done something more demonstrative when Putin used nerve agent on the streets of Salisbury.
Yeah, I think, again, what you're going back to is like that was that moment as well, as if we'd have acted, Russia wouldn't probably not be as embedded in Syria as they are now. Because I think they really came on the scene after that, didn't they?
Yeah.
So while we're on the subject of Putin, who I've got a love-hate relationship with Putin. I think, obviously, as someone in the Western world, I'm a bit afraid of him. But if I was in Russia, I'd fucking love him. Do you have any kind of like favorite political or military history leaders from any kind of period in history? Anyone that you look up to and think, God, I wish this bloke was around now?
I did have a note from Putin a few years ago.
Really?
Yeah, David Noss and I managed to rescue 500 orphans from Aleppo back in 2016, and David managed to speak to Putin and his crew to organise a ceasefire. And David had said he got a note saying, "Tell your mate de Bretton-Gordon to stop accusing Assad of using chemical weapons." Wow. And I sort of went, "Oh, crikey!" Wow. So I asked some chums in the intelligence world whether I needed to be worried. No, the view came back was, no, Hamish, there are a lot more people in front of you, so no, you shouldn't be worried. But that's the sort of thing he does. But going back to people in history, I'm not sure about dictators and else. I mean, the thing about dictators and people like Putin is they don't care. They're not worried about the second and third order consequences, and if you're not worried about that, you can basically do what you like. And of course, Putin stayed in power for, 20 or 25 years. I mean, the same with your man in Belarus, who looks like he's getting his comeuppance. But, fundamentally, these people are pretty evil. And, one can't. I would prefer to focus on, very apposite with the 75th anniversary of, the end of the war, VJ Day. One of my great heroes is Field Marshal Slim, his book Defeat into Victory, and all the sort of things that he was saying about soldiering is just, it was so true. Back it for the Forgotten Army, and so true during my career, and I'm sure everybody else's. So I think I like to think of some of the the great moral leaders rather than the great immoral leaders. But Putin's right up there for sure.
Yeah, I was also thinking about Slim this weekend, and I'd like anybody that's listening go out and go out and look him up. Incredible bloke, and because I always think to myself, God, to have someone like that around now would be. I feel like we're lacking that kind of that kind of leadership. Maybe it's just leadership for a bygone era, though. Maybe it doesn't work anymore. Who knows? In these days, he'd probably get accused of he'd probably tweet something that he said 20 years ago that would come back and cost him his job. Everybody seemed to be a big fan of David Petraeus until he sent someone a picture of his dick. So, you can get cut quickly out of these things these days. In terms of the book process, that must have, you've got so much stuff that's gone into this. How hard was it, one, to organise your thoughts and to get that all into a book? And two, what was it like in terms of like emotionally? Did you find was it hard, or did you find it like it was a release, or how did that go?
A very interesting piece, and I think I mentioned at the beginning a chap called Damian Lewis persuaded me to do it, and actually
the actor Damian Lewis.
No, the author. He's a very famous author. Writes a lot of books about the history of the SAS and elsewhere, and he also writes a lot of fiction books. He's really good. People should look him up. Some fantastic books. But I'd been giving him some technical advice. He wrote some fiction, or helped Bear Grylls write some fictional books, and I provided some of the storylines. But he suggested and introduced me to his agent, who then sort of went, "Yeah, this is really interesting." I then had help writing the book from a chap called James Layton. He's a brilliant wordsmith. So, yeah, over a year or so, I wrote a lot of the stories down. There is a lot left out, which the caveat at the beginning of the book really saying, we had to change and leave things out for security reasons. I mean, the last thing I wanted to do was to give any of our adversaries, help in sort of this, and the delisting process took a while. But organising the thoughts was that was interesting, and the advice getting on how to lay it out was slightly different to what I originally thought, and actually then when you read it, you sort of think, bloody hell, did this sometimes I think, did this happen? And I think back, yeah, it did actually. So that was, and whether is it a cathartic thing? I think it is. It's, there are a few difficult bits in there. There's one piece where I had to put my Labrador down, who I'd had for 14 years, and I sort of think, at the time, I just thought, God, why are you getting so emotional? But I took the poor dog to the vet, and he was in the back of the car, and but his name was Butler. He was finished. His legs didn't work. He was on his way out. The kindest thing to do was to put him down. But to me, it was shocking. I sort of, as the vet said, give me your paw. And he sort of gave him his paw. And I said, don't, you're going to die. And he died in my hands. And I had to, it was almost worse than seeing, this might sound completely terrible, than seeing a human die. And then had to take myself away. And my wife, who's a builder, we were building a new house, and the plot it was on, I went there for the whole day and dug a hole, and I was in bits. I just couldn't. It was unbelievable. It was almost as though 25 years of doing all the military and Syrian stuff just sort of came out, and I couldn't. It was all around putting a dog down. So I think it was quite an offloading process. But then again, I sort of. I speak to my Syrian doctor chums almost daily, and they're still in Idlib. They're still fighting the fight every day. And I sort of think, God, bloody hell, these people are doing. And I think over time, it sort of does get to you, and then you need to sort of come back to the surface, have a big, suck of breath and a get a grip and then go on again. I think you do have a sort of I can't remember. It might have been Slim or somebody else. So you have a bank account that you use up, and then you need to sort of top it up again. And certainly with the cancer thing, that was, although it's I'll die with it, probably not of it. And the heart thing, again, I sort of got used to that. But it's the more, I think the thing about the book is you alluded to it earlier. What are the people? What are my mates gonna say? The people who are around at the time and all the rest. Obviously, there are not many who were in Syria, if any at all. But so I'll be interested to see. And in the military, we're not very good at, as you say, the sort of tall poppy syndrome. People, I can just people say, yeah, okay, what's he doing that for? Which is why I've been very clear. To me, it's all about Syrians, chemical weapons, and health. So I don't. I'm not that bothered if I get a bit of stick, but if it helps a few people, then that's great.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to ask you is, because I think this is something that a lot of veterans have a problem with, because I think a lot of people join the military because you want to do the right thing. You want to stand up for people who are getting bullied, essentially. There's a lot of it. How do you kind of distance yourself, or not distance yourself, that's not the right term. Obviously, like you said, you still have friends that are in Syria. The stuff is still going on there. It's terrible stuff. How do you disconnect from that to be able to have time with your family, to be able to have time at home? How have you managed to find that balance? What is it that stops you kind of, basically going one way or the other and spending all, having to cut off completely from it or go in? Because I think that's something that a lot of us have a difficulty with is people are either all in on these things or all out. It's very hard to kind of balance the two up. So I'd love to know how you manage that.
Well, again, that's a great observation. If you spoke to my wife, she'd say, no, he's always on it, 7 days a week, all the time. And I had a particularly bad, when David and I rescued the children from Aleppo, there were a number of very high profile celebrities involved who I don't name in the book because they'd sue me, and I certainly wouldn't be able to, who actually got very cross because there was a time when they wanted to bring all these kids back to the UK, which would have been wrong in every guise. And on Christmas Day, no, it was Christmas Eve, when David and I had sorted this out, and these celebrities were not getting their time, in the media as saving all these children. And one of them rang me up and just, shouted and screamed and effed and blinded, how David and I had ruined their chance to, be shown as heroes. And I just thought,
oh my God,
I thought, you wankers. But anyway, because at the end of the day, the children were saved. They stayed in Syria where they should be. The ones who were badly injured were sorted out in Turkey. Bringing them to the UK would have been absolute nuts. So I'm lucky. I've got a great family, a great marriage and wife who keeps me grounded. And if I'm overdoing it, will just quietly let me know that that's the case. But it is tricky. I mean, it's very difficult. Exactly as you said, it's very difficult to stand back and do nothing when you think you can do something. And again, it's your point about the bullies. It's very difficult standing back, holding the coats while the others are getting stuck in. And it should be ever thus. I mean, that's what us military people are about. If you can stand back and do nothing where you could do something, then that is not the right thing. I'd much prefer to get stuck in and try and help. And if it doesn't work, so be it. But it's better to have tried and failed than not have tried at all. That's
a great place to leave it. Hamish, thank you so much for today for conversation. I've learned a lot, and I hate to say the word enjoyed, but I've enjoyed the conversation. And I really appreciate the work that you do, and I appreciate the fact that you've written this book, because we need more people talking about it. We need to get it out there, because this stuff is still going on. I think it's just this ongoing tragedy that there just doesn't seem to be any end of, and there's never going to be an end to it until people are talking about it and people demand of their politicians that something gets fucking done. It's just as simple as that. So the more people know, the better. So thank you for writing this book.
Well, thanks very much for giving me the time to sort of tell the story and all the great work that you do. So it's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers, Hamish. I'll let everybody know where they can find the book. Are you online anywhere? Is there people they can find you online? Do you have a social media presence? Or?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Hamish DBG.
Fantastic. That's a nice simple one. that is.
Yeah. What's your Twitter handle?
I at GRJ Books, but I don't really use it because I find Twitter to just be so flipping toxic.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I'm on Instagram as well, the same handle.
Oh, fantastic. We'll get you on Instagram, but I'll tag everything up in the show notes so people can click straight through onto that. But Hamish, thanks so much today. I'm looking forward to grabbing a copy of the book.
Well, I'm sorry you weren't. I'll ask them to send you a copy. I thought they would have done that, but no dramas.
Such as publishing. Yeah, there we go. Well, cheers, mate. Thanks for coming on, and we'll catch you next time. Cheers.
Yeah, we'll do. Cheers. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
Right, guys, thank you for listening to today's podcast. I know that was a bit heavy at times. I'm not going to lie. I definitely had wet eyes at a few points there, and I did. We recorded this the other week. I'm recording the intro a week later, and when I went home that evening, really kind of puts your life in check when you see that kind of thing, and you're like, wow, gives you a whole different perspective when you're thinking about Syrian kids with their arms and legs missing. They still got a smile on their face. So Hamish, thank you not only for coming on the podcast, but thank you for the work that you had done and that you are doing. I think it's very important work, and we are all grateful for it. I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody when I say that. Guys, I want to say thank you to the Royal British Legion. They make it happen. No British Legion, no podcast. End of. Go and give them a follow. Don't make me come and find you. The other thing as well I want to say, guys, is the fee. You don't charge for the podcast. But if you guys enjoyed it, how about leaving a review? How about telling a friend? How about making a post on social media? Putting the podcast together takes time, takes effort from myself, from other people, from, there's people out there who are making posts every week. And I want to shout you guys out and say thank you. Like, you guys are making the posts. Really fucking appreciate it. And guess what? When it comes time to do live events and all that kind of stuff, once all this coronavirus stuff is fucking done with, then there's going to be some, like, if you've been on board helping us, and we're going to be on board with helping you, put it that way. And if you could leave a review, or if you could tell a friend or make a post, not asking too much, is it, guys? It takes 2 minutes for you to make a post on social media to literally just share what you're listening to and just say, I enjoyed this podcast. Boom. That's all we're asking. Not asking for your organs, not asking for your sexual favours yet. So, scratch our back, we'll scratch yours. Let's keep this a community of helping each other. And on that note as well, thank you so much for Combat Comb Over for sponsoring today's podcast. All right, you fuckers, I'm out of here. I'll catch you next time. Love you, bye.
Yeah. Listen. Shout out Teaser. You told me not to worry, and you wouldn't break my heart. You told me you were sorry, yeah, my whole world fell apart. You said it's not my fault, and yeah, I've never done you wrong. I'm grinding to a halt, now I can see you're moving on. I promised I'd get better, and I told you things would change. You keep me to the gutter, yeah, I'll never be the same. I've gotta let you go, now live your life and spread your wings. And yeah, you put on quite a show, and pulled the puppet strings. And are you sure that you don't want me? Remember all the pain, or maybe you should thank me. It's your loss and my gain. I'm leaving now forever, I won't hang my head in shame. But yeah, you've taken me for granted, and you should feel ashamed. You sold a dream to all of us, a dream that we'd all die for, a reason for us all to live and something we could fight for. I might just help a man up to his feet or hold a newborn, but no matter what I do, my hands remembering my rifle, yeah.
Life's hard, I know that, still wouldn't change shit. I wouldn't go back, yeah, I wouldn't go back. Feelings I hold back, memories fade, yeah, they go fast, yeah, they go fast. Good times to come and go, survive the highs and lows, just take it step by step, I guess, yeah, I suppose. Good times to come and go, survive the highs and lows, just take it step by step, I guess, yeah.